Hello, my name is Michelle Taylor. I am the founder and executive director of Sankofa Summer School. I am so happy that you have joined us this evening, and we are in for a treat. This is our sixth year running this program, and each of the classes have been selected to represent the diversity and the beauty of people of the African diaspora. I brought in some experts who are going to share everything that they know with you. We hope that you are engaged in this class, that you keep it interactive, have questions for our facilitator, and overall, I hope that you just really enjoy yourself and gain something, some new knowledge from this. We're so happy that you're here. At the end of the class, please consider filling out the feedback form. It helps us improve every single year. And without further ado, here's your class.
Hi, everybody. I am Kim Rogers, super excited to be talking to you about self-revolution today. Today's session really leans into the wisdom of Black feminisms to explore a framework that I've created to support everyday people in doing the inner work of collective liberation. I'm of the mindset that the only way to disrupt and dismantle the harmful systems that create a culture of inequity is to really become people who put our politics into meaningful practice. And so the goal of the framework is to really help us close the gap between the values that we claim, the world that we say that we want, and our willingness to hold the responsibility of bringing that world into being. So before we start, I just want to highlight that this session is really rooted in an Afrocentric approach to learning, right? Dr. Malefike Asante developed Afrocentricity as a theoretical framework in the 1980s. And since then, a lot of really wonderful scholars have expanded on this paradigm, giving us a template to guide our educational praxis. And so just simply, being Afrocentric means centering Africana people in their own narratives and making them the subjects, not the objects of other people's stories. And so, for most of us, our learning experiences have been primarily Eurocentric, right? We learn that European ways of knowing and being are the best and universally applicable. But Afrocentricity really challenges this notion of European/white supremacy and encourages us to center ourselves as Africana people first and foremost. So our flow for the day, the evening, I'm going to give a little introduction into what I call the hex and then shift into the three elements of my framework for breaking the hex. So we'll talk about reclaiming our consciousness, confronting our self-concept, and embodying a liberatory practice. So what is the hex? The hex is a complex web of interlocking systems that create and maintain cultures of inequity by manufacturing racial, social, and economic hierarchy. The hex uses constructs of identity, so things like race, gender, class, disability, sexuality, nationality, to really calculate what we are worth, what we are owed, what we deserve, and what we can access. And I got the term, the hex, excuse me, from my witchy sister, Cicely Rogers. But my definition is really a synthesis of what our elders in the Black feminist and radical traditions have been articulating for decades, right? The Combahee River Collective's 1977 statement gave us language for the structure and impact of the hex, making it really clear that major systems of oppression are interlocking and that, quote, the synthesis of these oppressions creates the conditions of our lives. And then Patricia Hill Collins, in her book, Black Feminist Thought, really helps us to understand how the hex operates. And so, she explains that power relations are enacted through this matrix of domination that looms around us universally, but is really like experienced differently depending on contextual factors like where you live or what your unique intersecting identities are. Now, I see the hex as a vestige of what Sheikh Anta Diop referred to as the Northern Cradle. Diop studied the origins of the human race and the conditions of pre-colonial Africa. And in his two cradle theory, he suggests that in pre-colonial times, climate and resource availability created this fundamental difference in how culture developed in the Southern Cradle, which was home to African origins, and in the Northern Cradle, which was home to European origins. And those differences were then ingrained into each culture's social and political systems. And so on the screen here, you see like these pretty opposing worldviews, right? An abundance of vital resources versus a bareness. So there's that scarcity mindset there. The Southern Cradle had this sedentary agricultural, because of the climate and the resources. That's how they got their food and everything that they needed. Versus in the Northern Cradle was nomadic hunting. There was a more gentle, idealistic, peaceful nature as opposed to a more ferocious, warlike nature with this like spirit of survival. The Southern Cradle was very focused on matriarchy and matriarchal families, whereas patriarchy sort of reigned in the Northern Cradle. And I do want to make a quick note here about something that Diop says about matriarchy, which is that it's not an absolute and cynical triumph of woman over man. It's a harmonious dualism, an association accepted by both sexes, the better to build a sedentary society, right? So when we talk about a matriarchal family, we're not talking about flipping the terrible power dynamics of patriarchy on its head and then just having women reproduce them. We're talking about a fundamentally different approach to the way that man and woman and person, human, are engaging with each other. We also see differences in women being more emancipated versus debased, in xenophilia, which is a more welcoming approach to people of different cultures, versus xenophobia, a more collective approach in the Southern Cradle versus individualism in the Northern Cradle, right? And so Vulandlela Wubogo really extrapolated on Diop's theory to explore how the origins of white racism are a progression of the Northern Cradle's cultural orientation around control and individualism, distinctiveness, separation, conflict, hierarchy, and imposition, right? And so, for me, tracing the origins of the hex back all of those years tells us that it wasn't constructed overnight. This is a system that's been establishing and fortifying itself for hundreds and hundreds of years. Here in America, when European settlers colonized Turtle Island, they created a historical record that really portrayed them as the standard of civilization. And so, what this did was help to justify their violence by creating a belief that Europeans, who we of course now consider white people, were sophisticated and advanced, while indigenous and African peoples were framed as unintelligent, dangerous, and ultimately inferior. And that belief was then reinforced through structural violence, which was embedded into policies and practices of US institutions and systems to really ensure white supremacy as an outcome. And we see that outcome persist today across social health and economic measures. And because white people have prevailed across these measures for centuries, we've been conditioned to attribute those better outcomes to whiteness itself, which then reinforces the idea that whiteness is superior, and it sort of triggers that cycle all over again. And that cycle's been turning for ages, right? And so white supremacy has really endured as a fundamental driver of economic, legal, and social exploitation on the basis of race. But also, it's become this blueprint for other forms of identity-based hierarchy, which is why in my visual of the hex, I know I went through it kind of quickly, but I have white supremacy and anti-Blackness at the center. And so that false dichotomy and rhetoric around certain folks being good or bad, worthy or unworthy, valuable or disposable, has become this roadmap for how to oppress all types of identities in addition to race. And I think, whether folks realize it or not, that rhetoric and that blueprint for oppression is socialized into everyday people like you and me, which is why the work of becoming and breaking the hex that exists within us is so critical. For me, Black feminisms are the antidote to the hex. And they're particularly instructive because they are rooted in the experiences of a group of people whose oppression and exploitation is really the testing ground and benchmark for all other oppressions. Black women exist in a world that tries to undermine our agency and self-determination from the time we are born. And so we become very experienced in recognizing where structural imbalance exists and how it's created. And the beauty of Black feminism is that they don't just stop at naming the problem, they translate that analysis and that very intimate knowing of the hex into social and political practices for getting free. And so this is why I center Black feminisms in my framework. So let's talk about reclaiming our consciousness. In A Few Rules for Predicting the Future, which is an essay by Octavia Butler, she writes that the past is filled with repeating cycles of strength and weakness, wisdom and stupidity, empire and ashes. To study history is to study humanity. And to try to foretell the future without studying history is like trying to learn to read without bothering to learn the alphabet. What she's telling us is that we cannot create a more liberated future if we are continually divorcing past from present and action from consequence. Reclaiming our consciousness is about understanding that nothing happens in a vacuum. And so by rejecting the ahistorical and actively contextualizing the conditions of our lives and our society, we're engaging in an act of remembrance, but also an act of resistance. When we reclaim our consciousness, we make it harder for the hex to impose its worldview on us. But the hard part is, a lot of people don't recognize that their consciousness even needs to be reclaimed because of the way we are socialized and really propagandized from an early age. We perceive the consequences of the hex as normal, or if we know they're not normal, there's this sense that like, oh, this is unavoidable. And so there's this idea that like, well, this is just how things are. And so we have to actively push back against that by strengthening our capacity to really recognize both the origins of oppression and instances of when it's being enacted and or obscured in our daily life today. So I created this visual, which I call the machine of oppression, to help me organize my understanding of how the hex mechanizes a culture of inequity. And so the three elements that I like to focus on are narratives, policies, and practices, because there's a really, which I'll explain as I keep going, a really interconnected and reinforcing relationship between them. One thing that I want to note is that I absolutely believe that there's more than like three gears in the machine of oppression. I think everybody that's on this live stream could probably piece together their own idea of what it looks like. But these, again, three elements feel very essential to me. So narratives are socially constructed systems of meaning that shape cultural norms and influence how we interpret the status quo, how we perceive patterns of inequity, and how we gauge our responsibility to act. Institutions, policymakers, and corporate interests use dominant narratives to manufacture and justify inequitable outcomes through policy and practice. And when outcomes reflect those dominant narratives, it entrenches those dominant systems of meaning even further, and they get systematically reproduced in our lives. And so let's look at a few examples of how the machine works in real life. As I discussed in the opening, like I view white supremacy as the blueprint for all other oppressions. And so these examples really focus on white supremacy as a narrative and the impact on policy and practice. So here, gun violence continues to plague this country. And this slide looks at the difference in the way the media frames Black victims versus white perpetrators. So on the left, we see how Black victims get talked about, right? The slain Lakeland teen had been shot before, death possibly drug related. Latest homicide victim had history of narcotics abuse. Purported gang member murdered. In this article about Michael Brown, they literally said he was, quote, no angel, dabbled in drugs and alcohol, and had taken to rapping, as if any of those things are justification for being killed. And so there's this really intentional attempt by these stories to center information that is trying to undermine the character of these people in order to justify their deaths, right? They want you to believe that these guys deserved what happened to them. But on the right, the framing is very different, right? The Dark Knight shooting suspect seemed like a normal kid. Kyle Rittenhouse was cleaning graffiti before the shooting. Dylan Roof was a loner caught in internet evil. And so, the most, in these examples, the most sort of positive reflections about these guys are front and center. The stories are really trying to separate the shooter's actions from their personhood and attempt to get you to believe that they are good people who did a bad thing, and they did that bad thing because of some external circumstance, not because they're bad. And so the differential in who is humanized and who is scrutinized is clear when you see all these examples compiled in one place. But this isn't how we get information, which means we have to be more actively discerning. We have to look beneath what's on the surface of what we encounter and interrogate the focus, the framing, the language, and the assertions that we're seeing. So since narrative shapes, and these three slides that you'll see, they're not necessarily interconnected, but hopefully they still make sense. Since narrative shapes how we interpret and respond to what's happening in the world, it follows that policies become a reflection and policy decisions become a reflection of those narratives. And so because white supremacy is the narrative, we see it play out in who gets to inform policy, right? We know that voter suppression, which directly ties into the people who get to make our policies, voter suppression is very real, and systemic racism as sort of the core of that continues to create this political environment in which Black political determination is they're constantly trying to steal it. It also influences who gets to shape policy, right? Like this study talks about local governments favoring the white and wealthy, and this other headline talks about how there's such a small percentage of state house legislators that are Black. So this is on like every level of government we're dealing with. And then when there's a bias in who gets to inform policy and shape policy, the impact is that who benefits and who suffers from policy also aligns with that. And so hopefully you can start to see the connection between how the narrative of white supremacy is not just it's not just words, right? There are really tangible impacts on people in their lives. And this last example also demonstrates that, because we know that on a daily basis, we see white supremacy play out around us. And it's not always as blatant as this example, but we know that the undercurrent is always there. And so these images are from a Trump rally in 2020, where hopefully you can see it well, but the LAPD is literally only policing the counter protesters who are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, while across the street, right, the racist fascist MAGA rally is happening unimpeded. And so again, hopefully you get to see, whose speech, ideology, and bodies are protected, right? Who has autonomy and who doesn't? What does consequence look like for people based on their race and their other social identities? There's a really sort of there are tangible impacts of narrative, and our ability to address those first requires us to recognize when narratives are at work. And just one more example that is actually more cohesive, so hopefully you can see like the direct relationship between narrative policy and practice. If we look at the issue of homelessness, right, this the Black headline next to the narrative gear says, America has decided that homeless people aren't people. And we're fed a lot of information in pop culture and media that has created this idea. If you look at the three headlines there, it says, yes, the homeless are more violent. Not that long ago, a Fox host said we should just kill homeless people who don't want to get help. And so the impact of this, if you look at the top right of the screen, is that under the guise of protecting public safety, government agencies are making legislative and budget decisions that dehumanize and harm folks experiencing homelessness. And so what happens is that when systems and institutions enact those hostile measures, it gives the everyday public the green light to also practice that hostility, and to do it often without consequence, as you see in the headlines at the bottom right of the screen, which then reinforces this narrative that unhoused people don't deserve compassion, humanity, care, or justice. And again, because of the way we consume information, it's easy to perceive oppression as a series of one-offs instead of an interconnected infrastructure, right? These aren't singular phenomena or aberrations. They are deeply connected and systematically reinforced. And so when we take time to think critically about the information we encounter, about the quote official record of things, about the relationship between narrative, policy, and practice, we can start to defend our consciousness against the hex's attempts to really lull us into this false belief that oppression and inequity are unavoidable. So the work of reclaiming our consciousness really boils down to engaging in these really consistent and persistent practices of questioning and contextualizing. And this doesn't just apply to what's happening around us, it also applies to what's happening within us. Decontextualization isn't just occurring at a structural and systemic level, We're often decontextualizing our personal lives as a way to avoid the discomfort of cognitive dissonance. And so the work of becoming also requires us to do something very difficult, which is to confront our own self-concept. In an essay that is in Sister Outsider, Audre Lorde says that the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely oppressive situations which we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within us. This is such a central feature of Black feminist thought, this notion that social transformation requires change, not just at these higher levels, but also on an individual level. You know, a lot of folks get rightly riled up about changing the system. But I think what a lot of people fail to realize or don't want to acknowledge is that we aren't separate from that system. That culture of inequity that I've been referencing is socialized into every aspect of our lives and reproduced by us in visible and invisible ways every day. And so this means that we, the people, fuel the infrastructure that sustains racial, social, and economic hierarchy. When you think about the places we work, to the consumer decisions we make, to the way we interact with people who are different from us in some way, we've all played a role, and that could be large or small. It could be direct or indirect. It could be conscious or unconscious in sustaining this unjust world. And so when we talk about confronting our self-concept, it really starts with being willing to contextualize ourselves as entangled in systems of harm. The work of becoming requires us to get radically honest about the gaps between who we say we are and how we're actually moving through the world. So, you know, thinking about dissonance here, right? You care about workers' rights, but won't cancel your Amazon Prime membership. These are just some examples. You know that AI is detrimental to humans and the environment, but you can't resist asking ChatGPT to think for you. You claim to hate billionaires, but you'll make excuses for the ones whose music and makeup you like. You might post protect Black women one day, but then go buy tickets to an Usher and Chris Brown tour the next, right? And so these things are incongruent. But we tend to avoid reconciling that incongruence because it's really uncomfortable. Nobody likes cognitive dissonance. And so I think a lot of people, we have this habit of distorting our self-concept as needed to avoid dealing with the reality that our values and our actions are out of alignment. And the longer that you exist in this state of incongruence, the harder and scarier it becomes to really try to piece yourself back together. Prentice Hemphill talks about this fear in a podcast episode they did a couple years ago. Asa, could you pull that up for me?
Make it so that our identities are less contingent on The question I have is like, how do we make it so that our identities are less contingent on dominance, or less contingent on getting constant reinforcement or affirmation from one another? Because I see white supremacy obviously working in similar ways. I think about that interview with Toni Morrison where she's talking about white supremacy and she's talking about whiteness. And she says, if you take away this myth of white supremacy from white people, they are faced with the question of, am I any good? Like, what am I made of? And our fear of confronting that question, who am I actually? What am I made of? Keeps these systems in place. It boggles my mind that the fear of that question is so intense that, people will say, when we're talking about patriarchy or talking about toxic masculinity, you're anti-men or you don't want men to exist, instead of facing the question of who am I? And how much have I outsourced or made my self-identity contingent on other people?
Mm-hmm. So that's just a really incredible episode. Highly recommend listening. But I just want to iterate this piece about our fear of confronting the question of who we are and how that fear keeps systems of harm in place. Every time we excuse ourselves from confronting our own harmful behaviors as a way to protect our self-concept, we give the worst of humans permission to continue with their harmful behavior, right? We leave the door open for inhumanity. So confronting our self-concept is really necessary for tending to humanity, right? Both our own and that of others. This Instagram post by Jessica Denise Dixon, who's a coach and a community builder who focuses on embodying liberation, really explains what happens when we decontextualize ourselves. And so she says, every part of you, your identity and your body, has context in time and space, now and back then, here and there. We carry histories within us, our histories, our ancestors' histories. Anytime we deny our context, we deny our humanity. Anytime you deny your humanity, you give yourself permission to behave inhumanely without any commitment to answerability or responsibility for the impact of your behavior. So, going back to what Octavia Butler told us about studying history, when she tells us that studying history is how we study humanity, that also means getting deeply familiar with the history of self. When we see ourselves as separate from history, systems, power, other people, the planet, we lose touch with the ways that we are connected to everything and the ways that we must be responsible and accountable for our actions in relation to all of those things. I forgot to advance my slide, sorry. So bringing back the machine of oppression, not only do we have to see it working on a societal level, we have to be able to locate ourselves within the machine by reflecting on how these three elements show up in our own lives. And so when it comes to narrative, right, we've got to be asking questions that help us understand who influenced my worldview, right? What stories have I internalized? And how has that impacted how I make meaning about the world? When it comes to policy, this is thinking about, what beliefs, values, principles, social contracts, and norms govern how I exist in the world, right? What are my personal policies? And then from a practice standpoint, this is really where the two converge. And this is about thinking about how does the way I make meaning about the world and how do the policies that govern me converge to influence how I engage and act in and with the world. And so these questions can really help us figure out the degree to which our worldview is upholding the hex, to think about in what ways we are facilitating the culture of inequity versus disrupting it. And again, what gaps exist between our values and our actions. And so in the work of becoming, confronting our self-concept, it really calls us to remember and relate, right? To past and present, to our human and more than human kin, to the planet and environment, to systems and institutions, and maybe primarily, right, because we have to see ourselves as human first before we give a damn about anybody else's community. We have to remember and relate to ourselves. And so doing that is really how we keep our humanity intact. When we understand our own positionality in a society that values certain people over others, and when we intentionally consider the ways that other people are impacted by their own positionality, we can act with more self-awareness, more accountability, and more concern for the collective. So now, even when you get to a point where questioning and contextualizing, remembering and relating are second nature, there's still a gap between being able to see the hex and being willing to intervene and dismantle it. Plenty of people want to see a more just world, but many are looking for someone or something else to bring it to life. Right? We cheer on activists and organizers who are boots on the ground, right? And we'll double tap, double tap, double tap in support. We feel this like vicarious sense of altruism when celebrities or people who we like do the like donate the tiniest fraction of their massive wealth to causes we support. We hope against hope that politicians are going to magically begin to act in the interests of the most vulnerable people, even though they continually demonstrate that their only loyalty is to corporations and capitalists who fund their campaigns. We don't recognize, and really I think it's that we don't want to be responsible for holding our own power, because then we have to do something with it. And so we choose to put our fate into someone else's hands. Asada reminds us that the work of liberation cannot be done without the work of self. We've seen this repeated throughout this presentation. So embodying a liberatory practice means strengthening our capacity to think, imagine, feel, and self-determine through a lens of liberation, which isn't easy in a world that does everything it can to really flatten all of us into disempowered, disembodied beings. We are easier to manipulate and control that way. And so I intentionally refer to this as a practice because that's what it is. It's this ongoing process of trying and trying and trying again, and until we evolve. And there's going to be failures in that too. I don't talk about this here because there's not enough time, but we also have to be comfortable with not getting it right. And making space for other people to not get it right. That's like a tangent, and I'll put a pin in that for some other session that I do. But there is also something to be said about how difficult it is, I think, to try to evolve, because there's this sort of, I think in certain spaces, there can be this sort of purity politics, or even political correctness, I think, has been co-opted into like this weird thing. When the reality is the people that we need to be organizing with are folks that might not know, how to use your pronouns, or might still say the R word, right? Like there's something to be said about what it means to fight for collective liberation alongside people who are at different parts of their journey. But anyways, back to the evolution piece, right? This is a practice, it is a process. And for each evolution we make, there's another one waiting for us. And it should be that way. And so we have to approach the work of becoming as perpetual and unfinished. And rather than be overwhelmed by that, I think we should feel less burdened, right? Like it means we don't have to do it all. We just have to commit to doing our part in the journey. So I want to share this poem by June Jordan. Asa, if you could pull that up for me.
No longer lightly walk behind one of you who fear me. Be afraid. I plan to give you reasons for your jumpy fits and facial tics. I will not walk politely on the pavements anymore, and this is dedicated in particular to those who hear my footsteps or the insubstantial rattling of my grocery cart, then turn around, see me, and hurry on away from this impressive terror I must be. I plan to blossom bloody on an afternoon surrounded by my comrades singing terrible revenge in merciless accelerating rhythms, but I have watched a blind man studying his face. I have set the table in the evening and sat down to eat the news. Regularly I have gone to sleep. There is no one to forgive me. The dead do not give a damn. I live like a lover who drops her dime into the phone just as the subway shakes into the station, wasting her message, canceling the question of her call, fulminating or forgetful but late, and always after the fact that could save or condemn me. I must become the action of my fate. How many of my brothers and my sisters will they kill before I teach myself retaliation? Shall we pick a number? South Africa, for instance. Do we agree that more than 10,000 in less than a year, but that less than 5,000 slaughtered in more than 6 months? Well, what is the matter with me? I must become a menace to my enemies. And if I ever let you slide, who should be extirpated from my universe, who should be cauterized from Earth completely, law and order jerk-offs of the first, a terrorist degree, then let my body fail my soul in its bedeviled lecheries. And if I ever let love go, because the hatred of the whisperings become a phantom dictate I obey, in lieu of impulse and realities, the blossoming flamingos of my wild mimosa trees, then let love frees me out. I must become a menace to my enemies.
Yeah, I love that poem. And I put the line that stands out to me the most on the screen, which is, how many of my brothers and my sisters will they kill before I teach myself retaliation? And I feel like, June Jordan is really challenging us to reconcile with the ways that we passively consume the horrors of the hex and just keep going about our lives business as usual. I think she's asking us to reflect on where we'll draw the line. And I think that what we've seen just in the last 6 years is that the line just inches out further and further from where we initially said it was. People love to get into hypothetical debates about what they would, like, I am not my ancestors, but like, as if that's like a flex, or as if our ancestors weren't fighting. People love to get in these hypothetical debates about what they would have done during enslavement or civil rights or any other historical moment of oppression. But we're actively living through all of that right now. And so there's plenty of opportunity to do the things that you think you would have done at a different time. And so we have to embody and enact. We are all on the hero's journey in our head, but somehow that journey has become about enlightenment instead of embodiment. And so our task is to translate our awareness of injustice into a meaningful rejection of it, not in word, not in theory, but in the everyday practice of our lives. And so just to wrap us up here, I want to offer a set of questions and just walk through them with you slowly, and maybe even give you, we have until 7:45 before I want to leave about 15 minutes for questions. But I'll walk through these questions, and I just invite folks to start to think about these things. And so they're broken down into the 3 elements of the framework. But as you're thinking about reclaiming your consciousness, how do systems of harm use narrative, policy, and practice to either devalue, disempower, or disinvest in certain social groups, right? What are you noticing, and what connections can you make between all of those things? How does the culture of inequity shape your life directly? How does it affect your community? And then how are you seeing it influence broader society? And then, of course, think about, how have I been socialized to decontextualize history, protect power structures, and normalize harm? These are the questions we have to ask to really start to get a sense of, where has the wool been pulled over my eyes? And I want to be clear here. It is that I've had to sort of soften into this. I think if you're on this call, you probably have been on some form of a radical journey. And I know when I first started my work of becoming, you can get real self-righteous, right, about what everybody else is doing, and like, oh, you didn't know this, you didn't know that, like, wake up. But the reality is, particularly if you grew up here in the belly of the beast in empire, we are taught not to see things. And so as you work through all of these, I think it's really important to remember that there's like to be kind with yourself as you do this work of peeling back. I don't pose these questions. I didn't build this framework to make people feel bad about not being in a particular place. I did it because I was thinking about what I need to do for myself. And I thought, oh, I feel like other people are probably in this like weird, like these are the things that I hold really dearly that feel very important to me, but it's very hard. Like that juxtaposed next to this, like it's hard to divest from systems because they are woven so deeply into everything around us. But the when it comes to reclaiming our consciousness, that noticing, the more you notice, I feel like the more agency it gives you to be able to not just spot those things, but then once you can spot them, you can sort of dig into, okay, what can I do about it now? Confronting our self-concept, really thinking about what are my values. Going back to the Prentice Hemphill soundbite, I think for a lot of people, I think it's easy to frame your values in relation to what society tells us our values should be, if that makes sense. I don't know that there's necessarily a lot. Something that comes up for me is like, I think people are obsessed with this idea of being a quote good person, but what actually is a good person? Like good by whose terms? And what tangibly does that mean, right? And so I think we need to really get clear about what are our values. Where do my action, what do I really truly believe in when I slow down and think about myself and not think about what other people think my values should be or what other people will think of my values. And then once you have a real clear concept of that, really getting honest about where do my actions align with my values, right? Where is there a disconnect? Because that exists for all of them. Look, like say for me, for example, okay, I've given up shopping on Amazon now, but I still use Spotify, who was running ICE ads. And so this is not again, this is not about perfection. It's not about purity. I was actually on a call earlier today, and how I described it was like, when I think about breaking the hex, I envision myself like holding a bag of the hex's bullshit. And my job is to figure out what pieces can I take out of this bag? Like, what can I throw away? I might not ever be able to empty the bag completely, but I can lighten what I'm carrying on behalf of the hex. I can lighten and pull back on my role in perpetuating a culture of inequity. And so thinking about this question too of, in what ways am I entangled in systems of harm? To what extent is my, again, self-concept shaped by social and cultural definitions of a good person? And how is that different from, I've heard of Kobus. How is that different from like how you would actually feel whole and authentic and not just quote good? And then another thing that's like hard to do, but to get honest about, how do I use avoidance or how do I rationalize to protect my self-concept? And then finally, as you think about embodying a liberatory practice, right? Where does my sense of responsibility for collective liberation begin and end, right? Whose struggles are intertwined with my own, and what parts of the work can I hold? Because I think that's another thing that gets people tripped up, is feeling like, I've just gotta, there's so much and I can't care about everything and care. Like, there are pieces that are for you to deal with. And so it's about being real intentional about finding what those pieces are, but also because there is so much interconnection when you look about the root causes of things, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, there's a lot of other issues that intersect with those. And so how do you, when you feel overwhelmed by the massiveness of the hex, how do you find people who are also working to like chip away at the pieces? And then also thinking about, what do I need in order to bring my values and action into alignment? Because that's a real thing too. For choice, your ability to choose what you do and don't do is also limited by the hex, right? Everybody doesn't have the same set of choices, which means everybody can't make the same set of sacrifices. What's in everybody's bag is different, and what they have to hold and what they're able to put down is also different because of that. And so it's also good to get real clear about, what do I need to be studying? What do I need to know? What skills do I need? What resources and relationships do I need? And that's going to be unique to all of us. And then finally, how can I leverage my positionality and work within my sphere of influence to undermine systems of harm? And again, that asks us to really think about, what am I willing to risk and sacrifice? What can I do right now? And what do I need time to figure out? So yeah, that's my framework for the work of becoming, inspired by the really wonderful, beautiful Black feminists that I've shared here and many more. And I thank you guys for being here, and I'm happy to take any questions that y'all have. Appreciating the feedback. Thank you. Much appreciated. And I got to thank Michelle, Dr. Taylor, for coordinating this. This is truly incredible and just right on time for where I am with my journey. So I am very grateful to have had the opportunity to give this lecture. It doesn't seem like there's any questions coming in, which is cool. If folks want to, I don't know if I can, you can find me at, well, you got the resources, but if you want to email me, or if you have follow-up questions or anything, or if you're part of any like community-based groups or coalitions or anything where you feel like this would be useful, because what I actually like to do when I have more time is to have people like actually start to work through some of these questions, and also do some imagination about what a liberated future looks like. But you can reach me at, let me actually double check because I never use this email. I think it's breakingthehex@gmail.com, but let me just double check. Yeah, you can reach me at breakingthehex@gmail.com if you have any follow-ups. Okay, a question from Kalisa. How would you go about explaining breaking down the hex to people who want to start this work? It's so... It is tricky. I mean, I feel like I guess I can't. I think the visuals are so helpful because a lot of this stuff feels abstract to people, right? And so that's why I created the visual of what the hex actually, how I envision it. But when I guess if I were to sort of synthesize it, I would say that there are systemic and structural forces that are shaping the choices we have in this life, what is accessible to us, and influencing how we engage with the world. And breaking the hex is about really, really, again, identifying what are those things, reflecting on in what ways am I entangled in those systems, and then what does it look like to get free? Ooh, good question. If I were to have, hopefully that answers you, Kalisa. Is there a way you would prioritize the questions, actions under the embodied section? I don't think so. Although, so the 3 questions, I don't think you guys can still see them. So it's like, where's my responsibility? What do I need? Like basically, how do I need to resource myself? And how can I leverage my positionality? Actually, I do think I wrote them out in the way that I would prioritize them, because I think because there are so many, we are in a poly crisis right now, as they call it, because there's so much to be tuned into. I think part of feeling more capable of contributing to collective liberation is being okay with not being able to do everything. And so that means really identifying what issues am I really called to? Whose liberation am I fighting for? And even though we're talking about collective liberation, again, all of us are not going to be able to, we can't free everybody. No one group can free everybody else. Although if we free Black women, everybody else will, as we know, be free. But I think really starting there and getting a sense of, okay, these are the issues that I care about. These are the groups that I want to focus on. And then tying this question of what resources do I need, what knowledge, skills, relationships. When you know what your sort of scope of work is, the parameters around what you're trying to do, then you can tap your resources and to connect to those things. And then once you have your resources together, you can really be thinking about, okay, what can how do I leverage what I have? How do I leverage maybe any institutional power I have at where I work? Or if you have more financial resources, how do I leverage these things? And really then taking your resources and figuring out how to apply them. Oh, this is such a hard question. Okay, one I'm gonna have to say is easy for me. Number one is my sister, who Cicely Rogers, who passed away in September 2024. She was a decade older than me and was just so damn instructive in terms of my journey of becoming. The hex is, like I said, language that I got from her, and this very much is my way of honoring her and continuing her legacy, but through my own lens. And so first and foremost, would love to be able to eat dinner with my sister again. I also think, I'm going to say Octavia Butler also, because that mind, the ability to make science fiction out of reality in a way that is so enduring, I think is really powerful. I think that there's a really deep, like, seeing, and not like a literal seeing, like a kind of a woo-woo seeing that Octavia Butler was able to do. And it would be really wonderful to sort of chat with her, and to get her perspectives about, like, her work. Much of her work was written so long ago, and yet we are living out. So people talk about her as being a seer, like her books being prophecy and her work being prophecy. And so I would love to know her perspectives on, what it is to be like, damn, I told y'all so, which Black women are often telling people what's coming and nobody's listening. And if I could pick one more, it's so tricky. I'm going to say June Jordan, just because she was so, like, clear with her poetry. And I think Octavia Butler is an artist too and an author, but for me, I feel deeply connected to Black feminisms that are rooted in using, like, art and creativity to tell the stories that we need to tell. So yeah, those are the ones I would pick. Yeah, thank you all. This was great. Well, if there's no more questions, I didn't see any more come in. Again, appreciate y'all. I hope everybody takes care, and hopefully we can connect at some point somewhere along the way again. But yeah, take care of yourselves.